Hello, dear listener. So today we're going to be talking about a couple of books and a couple of movies and maybe even some music, but I think we're going to start out with the main feature, which is a little book by Miguel Ángel Asturias, El Señor Presidente. Now, I've got here the Penguin Classics edition. This is a translation into English by David Unger, and it's quite a new translation. I believe that this was initially published in 2022. The actual original is quite older. I believe it was published in 1946 and was mostly completed, if not completely finished, by, I want to say 1932. So Asturias spent a little bit of time working this one over before he finally published it. Unfortunately, the English Penguin edition is not entitled El Señor Presidente. They've changed it to the more quotidian Mr. President. But alas. So, let's talk about this book. It's pretty short. It's only about 300 pages long. And it's furthermore separated into 3 parts. So each of these parts reads like a novella, I'd say. It takes about 2 hours per part, so the entire thing only took me about 6 or 7 hours. So reasonably short length. Now, if we look on the back here, the pitch Penguin goes for is, and to directly quote the back of the book, the original Latin American dictator novel. And I think this is somewhat fair, this interpretation, because it very much is a book about political malaise and the ways in which a dubious government filter down and affect the entirety of a society. But I think that's an important distinction, because this book isn't really about the president. In fact, the president barely gets any time at all. I can't even recall if he's ever named. He may very well be. Obviously, it's based on Manuel Cabrera of Guatemala, but I don't actually know if the president in this is ever given a name. He's not a really important character. He's more somebody who you can reflect, who the main characters are contrasted with or challenged by. So it's not really a book about the president, maybe not even a book about the way the president affects people. It's much more a book about how a system in general that's set up that's quite dubious ends up, I guess, impacting an entire culture, an entire country, an entire society. So the people who are the main players in this book, some of them are government figures, some of them are not government figures, but the president is not one of them. So the book's separated into 3 parts, like I said. Each of them is given its own little subtitle. I don't think the subtitles are particularly useful, so I'm just going to refer to them as parts 1, 2, and 3. Overall tone. This is an important point. The tone of this book, if you hear Latin American dictator novel, as I do, my immediate thought is dry political treatise. Obviously not a nonfiction treatise, but I'm thinking, a sort of political satire. The sort of thing that's a thinly veiled allegory, right, where the main point is the political message being set out. And I don't think that's the case with this book. This book is not, I don't think, primarily about the political atmosphere. It just uses that as a sort of setting to explore the sort of much more expressionistic tone it's going for. Like I said, it's very expressionistic, a little abstract, quite modern. It really does resemble much closer, very closely, a sort of 20s, 30s European style short novel or short story. It reminds me somewhat of Bruno Schulz. It's got that very kind of dense, knotty prose, very imagistic. Pretty much every paragraph in here you could take out and you get some sort of vivid mental image from it. It's very poetic in this sense, on the sort of spectrum from dry, fast reading that's primarily about plot and very dense, poetic writing that's primarily about image is very much the latter category, which I think is quite interesting because my experience, obviously, the reputation of Latin American literature that I've heard is very much that it turns into this throughout the rest of the 20th century. I did read a little book by Machado de Assis recently, which was very different, very dry, very spare, a bit like a Haydn string quartet. just very to the point, straightforward. This is not that at all. This is very, very wild and modern. But enough about generalities. Let's talk about specifics. So I have a couple of passages here that I'm going to read from, and this will include some spoilers. Again, I don't think this is a book that's primarily about the plot, so I don't think that hearing spoilers is going to ruin your experience. But if you don't want to hear spoilers, you can skip ahead. Well, let's start with part 1, early on. So part 1, very much about setting up the mood. And again, the mood is very much this political malaise. It reminds me quite a bit of a Shostakovich symphony. It's Shostakovich symphony in writing, right? And like in Shostakovich, the first movement is this long, exploratory, tone-setting passage. I really like the specific passage about Gennaro Rodas. I believe this is, chapter 9, entitled Glass Eye. And what I'm going to read from page 51. This reminds me quite a bit of the short stories of Anton Chekhov, so very much in that modern sensibility. So this is after Rodas has seen a political murder and has basically abetted it, right? Because he was talking with the man who commits this murder, trying to get a job with the secret police. It ends up falling through that deal, but he's there as his contact ends up killing a man. Rodas hid his face in the shadow over their son's cradle. He was in a bad mood. Without hearing what his wife said about the baptismal preparations, he put his hand up to block the candlelight in his eyes. He then quickly pulled back his hand, shaking it to cleanse the reflection of blood stuck to his fingers. The shadow of death flew up from his son's cradle as if it were already a coffin. The ghost was egg-white with cloudy eyes. It had no hair, no eyebrows, no teeth, and it twisted itself like the spirals that rise from the censer bowls at funerals. Gennaro heard his wife's voice in the distance. She was talking about her son, the baptism, the general's daughter, about inviting the next-door neighbor, the fat man who lived in front, other neighbors from around the corner, the restaurant friend, the butcher, the baker. Very, very intense. And this is, I think, the specific image that really sticks with me from this chapter. This is a couple of paragraphs later. An eye passed over the fingers of his right hand like light from a small lamp. From pinky to middle finger, then over to the ring finger, from the ring finger to the index, from index to thumb. An eye. A single, solitary eye. It seemed to be throbbing. He squeezed his hand shut, trying to crush it, his nails piercing his own flesh. But when he opened his hand, it reappeared on his fingers, no bigger than a bird's heart, and more terrifying than hell. Sweat like hot broth formed on his temples. Who was looking at him with this eye in his fingers, jumping around like a roulette ball, tolling like a bell at a funeral? Now, this eye, of course, it ends up being a sort of remembrance, a memory of the eye of the man who was shot by his colleague, I guess, the man he was trying to get a position from. So you can see already, this is not a book. I mean, obviously this passage is about something political. It's about the effect that, wanton political murders and a culture of violence has on a person. But it's not really about a political message, something utilitarian. It's much more about the sort of emotional effect this has on people. It's much less, it seems less interested in me to exploring like sort of political solutions, political problems process. It's much more interested in the emotions of it. And I think that's quite interesting because there are a lot of books, again, like I said, when I came into this, I was kind of expecting a dry political treatise, and that is not what this is. So I'm going to skip ahead now to part 2. This is going to be chapter 22. So the chapters are quite short, only about 5 to 10 pages per, which I imagine it will be quite useful for rereading this. They're very much like scenes, individual scenes. This is quite an upsetting passage. So Fedina, she was a maid who was in a house that a sort of bit of political intrigue happens in, and she ends up getting kind of scapegoated by the government, at least in part for it. And I think what's quite interesting is, how to put this, like throughout, there's very much this kind of insistence, this sort of focus on sort of people being caught in the crosshairs, I guess. Like, a big part, if the plot can be said to have some measure of importance, it's very much in the sense that the government doesn't care what the truth is. But it's very much in sort of vein of Orwell's 1984, right, where it's just whatever is politically convenient. And there's a number of scenes I didn't pick from this that are quite maddening, where it's basically just the government forcing people to claim something's true and outright denying, just saying, completely uninterested in what the actual truth is, only interested in what will be useful for them. In fact, there's a specific quote that was so impactful. I don't have it with me now, but I'll put it in the notes, that I think was really, really effective at pointing this out. This passage, though, is from one of these, the women who gets caught in the crosshairs of this. And she's put in jail, and as part of her punishment, her infant child, is put in jail with her. And as you could probably expect, given the terrible conditions in this room, the child does not make it. And what this paragraph is describing is her, I guess it's her description of how she's coping with that, how she kind of comes to accept it. When she couldn't weep anymore, she felt she was becoming her son's tomb, enclosing him in her womb again, that she was his final endless sleep. For a split second, pure joy stalled her endless suffering. The idea of being her son's tomb soothed her heart like a balm. She felt the joy Asian women feel when they elect to be buried with their lovers. Her joy was perhaps greater because she wouldn't be entombed with her son. She was the living tomb, the earthly cradle, the maternal lap where both of them, tightly united, would remain suspended until God called for them. Not wiping away tears, she straightened her hair as if going to a party. She snuggled into a corner of the cell and pressed his body, enveloped by her arms and legs, to her breasts. Tombs don't kiss the dead, so she shouldn't kiss him. On the contrary, they press heavily against them, just as she was now doing. Tombs are straitjackets of pressure and affection, forcing the dead to bear, quietly and motionless, the tickling of worms, the fire of decomposition. So, again, this entire passage of grief, right, is explained via this metaphor. But it's done in this really creative way. It's almost a sort of indirect, right, where Fedina is, not only is she like a tomb, but she is physically or sort of mentally working through this process, intentionally trying to be like that metaphor. Which is something interesting. I don't know if there's a similar passage in anything I've read recently. So that's quite interesting. I won't go into too much detail because this is running a little long. But chapter 28, this is the very start of part 3. Very, very interesting chapter. Very much in the style of Chekhov. Like a Chekhov play. It's just a conversation between, it initially seems like 3, but I think it ends up being 4 people. Yeah, 4 people in a jail cell having a conversation. And it's very much, it has kind of an affectation to it, a sort of Chekhovian, lots of repetitions, lots of, statements that are kind of blunt. But it's quite interesting. I would highly recommend it as sort of a taster, because again, it doesn't really have much connection with the rest of the plot. In fact, many of the characters in it are not mentioned really anywhere else in the book. So that's kind of an interesting passage. But the last passage I'm going to read is from, and this is a very spoiler-laden passage, so this is maybe the section that, if you want to avoid spoilers, you're not going to want to listen to. This is quite near the end. This is actually chapter 38. So, the basic thrust of the plot in this book is, if it can be called like a major plot, is that there's sort of a man who gets scapegoated for a murder of a political appointee. That's actually done by a homeless man with absolutely no political motivation whatsoever. It's just in response to this man's cruelty. But the government finds it advantageous to blame, to scapegoat somebody for it, this man named Canales. And so Canales flees. He's helped by an advisor of the president who, for reasons that we don't ever quite understand, is told by the president to, as sort of an element of kabuki theater, right, to get this man to flee, right, the country. And during this process, the appointee, right, who's doing this act of subterfuge, eventually falls in love with the daughter of the man who's fleeing. And so they end up getting married as she's ill, she seems to be on her deathbed, but she ends up pulling through. And this is now describing, he's eventually called away on business. And we get a nice little bit of changing genre, so the idea of, nature mimicking the emotions of the characters. A river ran over the roof as Camilla packed his trunk. It didn't flow inside the house, but drained much farther away, in the wide expanse leading to the countryside, or perhaps in the ocean. A fistful of wind opened the window. Water rushed in as if the glass had been shattered to bits. The curtains and loose papers rustled about, and the doors banged on their hinges. Still, Camilla continued packing. So, I think there's a wide amount of variety in the images. So you got this classic changing genre, this sort of nature imitating emotion. You've got this sort of emotional aspect viewed through metaphor. And then you've just got a lot of sort of maddening passages of just complete hypocrisy from the government and just complete indifference to whatever is true. And I think all of this together makes this quite a compelling book. I'm not sure it completely holds together. I think the plot is a little facile. It's not a book you read for plot. It's very much a book you read for images, and it's sometimes inconsistent, especially with this translation. This translation sometimes feels a bit try-hard. David Unger does generally a pretty good job, but there are certain times where it's very clear you're reading a translation from 2022. There's a lot of little, I guess I'd call them quirks, things where, words are repeated in ways that are a little, I guess, obnoxious. There are certain translations that are a little too keen on going for coarse language, I guess, in ways that don't feel like they match the very naughty rest of the book. I see here on the back it mentions Guatemalan vernacular. So maybe that's the Guatemalan vernacular coming through. Maybe it's a great translation. But there are moments that feel a little clunky. So I'm not sure this is a complete success as a recommendation, but I think if you like surrealist, modern, expressionistic novels, you're looking for something a little different, off the beaten track, you're not going to find loads of Guatemalan fiction, let alone Guatemalan fiction that is one of the books that won him the Nobel Prize. So yeah, I think all in all this is recommendable. Good stuff. So that is our first main course. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some minor things that I've read recently that I thought were interesting. And I've got a list of, 5 books. I'm not going to be going into specific quotations. These are just going to be brief impressions. Maybe I'll talk about these more in the future, maybe not. So let's start by talking about other pieces of written literature. So this one's a bit of a novelty item, but it's a lot of fun. It's by Law She, the Chinese author, also a modernist, sort of written about a similar time. I think it was early 30s. Catland, or City of Cats, or Land of Cats. All sorts of different translations of the title. I don't know Chinese, so I have no clue what the original title actually was. I read this translation, I think it was from the University of Michigan. Really obscure, but it's in PDF form out there on the internet. I'm sure you can find it. So Law She is most popular for Rickshaw Boy, and that's what I know him from. Very popular Chinese modernist novel. Actually kind of similar to Asturias. Sort of a similar kind of general structure and purpose. Catland, though, is very much a dry political treatise. It's a satire. It really reads, I think the thing it quote most closely resembles to me is H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. It's got that kind of, it's very spare, it's not very descriptive, and it's very obvious that this is an allegory, especially if you know something about early 20th century Chinese politics. But I like it. I think there's something kind of refreshing about it, like a neoclassical string quartet. There's something quite spare and quite inviting about it, as long as you're not going into it with unreasonable expectations. So that's a wide recommend, but you have to know what you're getting into with that one. Other reading. The other book I read recently was the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, something like that. What a lot Latin words, by Wittgenstein. So it's the only work that the Austrian philosopher published in his lifetime. Very interesting book. Most books of philosophy I've read have somehow left me disappointed. Not because they're not well written or they don't have good ideas. Many of them do, but they don't feel very rigorous. They just feel like a lot of thought exercises strung back to back to back. That's not true of Wittgenstein. I mean, he writes like a set theorist. The entire thing is structured into points. I mean, obviously people like John Locke did this too, but I mean, this is like rigorous one-sentence points written like theorems or something. So he doesn't go into a lot of detail of proving things, but it's very, very strange. You have to kind of get used to it. And I have a bit of a mathematical background, so it wasn't too difficult to get into it for me. So Wittgenstein. I think the more into the set theory he gets, the less interested I am. Now, I was never very good at set theory in school, so I don't know. Maybe other people will find it more interesting. But I certainly can't imagine a general audience finding his set theory stuff very interesting. But I think where he gets most interesting, and where maybe an abridged edition or an analysis of Wittgenstein could be quite interesting to somebody, is when he tries to like come to conclusions based on all of the logical statements he's going for. So a couple of things he says that I think are quite interesting. First, he's a big believer in this idea of language as a sort of tool to understand the world. He views everything as sort of definable by language by definition. And he sort of views something, it's basically views it as impossible to have anything that is not describable by language. And he basically argues that anything that's not describable by language is sort of outside of, existence. And he sort of touches on this, and I don't know how serious he is on it, but this was my interpretation at least. When he gets into ideas of sort of metaphysics, especially pseudo-religious ideas and spiritual ideas, he basically comes down on the point of, at some point these terms are not easily definable. Like, what is an afterlife or God or any of these, like these are very abstract concepts that are very difficult to understand. And I think he comes pretty close, or he at least gets at something I find quite compelling, where it's almost silly to talk about these things in sort of clear, definable, realistic, materialistic terms, because they're so kind of abstract, difficult to define. And so talking about them as if they're just, nonchalant, easy philosophical and logical concepts is kind of silly. So I think, I don't know how much I got from Wittgenstein, I don't know how correct my interpretation is, but the one thing I really do like is this idea on concrete language as a way of describing things, and a sort of admission that if something is not easily defined, or even definable at all, and it's impossible to describe it, and you have to just substitute in some undefinable word, like God or spirit or so on, it frankly becomes an unanswerable question, at least in the terms of logic. And I think that's quite a compelling argument. I'm not sure how original that is, but and I'm sure that's a surface-level interpretation, but that's what I got from Wittgenstein. So, no more writing. Let's talk about a couple of movies I watched recently. Okay. 2 movies that I'm going to be talking about today. First is Alexander Nevsky, or Alýyksandr Nevsky. I don't know how close my interpretation is. This is a Sergei Eisenstein film. This is kind of towards the end of his career. So this is very, very much lead up to World War II. I believe it's 38, maybe 39. And so this is very, very, very clearly setting up the Soviet Union for a possible war with the Nazis. So I don't know whether the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had been signed by this point. In any case, even when that had been signed, I think there was still some sense that war was possible. Stalin obviously thought he could get out of it, but clearly he was not able to get out of it. And so Alexander Nevsky is very much kind of propaganda against the Germans, using this example from, I want to say, the 13th century? Really long time ago. Very much a stage production. Now, I mean, it's shot many times it appears to be shot on location, quite beautiful locations. And I think the thing that sticks with me the most is how operatic it is. Like, this is very much not a realist portrait. This is very focused on sort of gesture and image, and I mean, anyone who's seen Battleship Potemkin, it's sort of a similar mold of that, but even more operatic. Like, it feels less like a tight modern film and more like one of those sprawling period epics. It's got classic kind of silly side characters, but I think the real standout here is the score from Sergei Prokofiev. Really, really nice score. Obviously, the Battle on Ice is quite famous, and I would recommend listening to the score separate. I'm sure there's probably some edition that's re-recorded the score, because the original recording is terrible, terrible recording quality. But I actually really like the intro music when you see the dead, a bunch of these skeletons laid out on the plains of Russia from some prior war. This is really, really nice music. I think Prokofiev wrote one of the best film scores, certainly of the black and white era, with this. Highly, highly recommend for the music. And there's some really, look, I'm not sure how into the propagandistic, look at the evil German Catholics type stuff, but there's some really cool shots, fear-mongering shots. It's good propaganda. So Alýyksandr Nýefskÿ, look, it's black and white, terrible recorded sound. I mean, you know what you're getting into if you're going into a 38 Soviet production, but if you like Eisenstein, you're going to like it. All right. Other movie, similar time period-ish, about 15 years later, 53, very, very different circumstances. This is an Alfred Hitchcock picture, Dial M for Murder. I liked it. I think the first half is much stronger than the second half. It reminds me quite a bit, it's like a better version of Hitchcock's Rebecca. Rebecca's a great book, by the way. I think much superior to the movie, even though the movie won the Academy Award. I think Hitchcock's Rebecca really struggles in the second half, right? As there's the trial and all of that, and it just goes way too fast, and it loses all sense of tension. Dial M for Murder does not lose that sense of tension as much. It does still, kind of, and it gets kind of confused in the second half. They skip the trial completely, which is a smart choice. I think the first half is a really strong bit. And honestly, I think you can just watch the first half of the movie and be satisfied. There's an intermission, it's a nice cut, and I really do think the first 50 minutes of this movie are something special. There are two scenes in particular that are extended scenes that are quite remarkable. The famous one, obviously, is and this is some spoilers, right? The attempted murder scene. And those scissors, my God, that is just classic Hitchcock, where you've just completely forgotten about the scissors, but it's been there the whole time, and the entire way that the main villain, I forget the characters' names in this, the main villain, right? He convinces his wife to stay at home by getting her to do all these newspaper clippings, right? And so that necessitates the scissors being out, and that's what ends up saving her life. Really, really great stuff. And of course, the next passage where he sort of comes up with a way to roll with it is also quite nice. But I also think the real passage I really, really enjoyed from this is actually earlier on. And it's the conversation he has with the man he ends up blackmailing. And the two of them, they've got this old-timey transatlantic accent kind of, suave conversation, a la Humphrey Bogart. And they're just such smooth talkers. And it's one of those situations that would be awkward if it were, real people in this scenario. But given that the directors have time to come up with lines, given these two actors know how to, read scripts in a compelling way, it just is really fun to watch. Good repartee. To watch the blackmail develop, really, really clever. The great line, now, obviously, is... the guy cedes, the main villain cedes, I was going to kill my wife, but then I saw something in this bar and decided not to. And then, of course, eventually the man he's blackmailing asks, well, what did you see in that bar? And he says, you. And what a great moment, because he realizes he can get this guy to kill his wife for him. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful passage. It's sort of like that one take in the Maltese Falcon, but Maltese Falcon? Yeah, Maltese Falcon, but longer. Really good stuff. So I think that one's an interesting movie. I don't think it's a complete movie. I think it really falls off in the second half. But still, first half's really nice. Last thing, music. So this, I think last week, was the 200th anniversary of the premiere of the first of Beethoven's late quartets. So opus 127, the string quartet number 12. I want to be honest, this is, I listened to it again with the score. I have a little score book that I got from, I believe it's from the University of Alabama Library. I don't live anywhere near Alabama, so I'm not really sure how it ended up where I got it, but thanks, University of Alabama, I guess. I have a full score book and I followed along. I want to be honest, I find this one actually the most difficult of the late string quartets. It's got all of the sort of features of the other ones. It's got the sort of big kind of portentous vibrato, soft passages, really long slow movement, kind of weird, quirky, lots of tempo changes in the first movement. That recording I listened to was Alban Berg, who I thought did a decent job with it. It still didn't feel like it quite cohered with me. I don't think I get it quite, because at this point it just kind of, because I'm much more familiar with the other four, the other four late quartets, it's hard not to compare it to them. I think the closest to successfully getting it I got was in the slow movement, which I think is still quite an interesting movement. It's not quite as good, or at least not quite as compelling to me as, the harp or some of the Razumovskys. But I mean, it's probably better than any of the Opus 18s. It's just as good as the Serioso doesn't even really have a particularly meaty slow movement. So yeah, I think there's a lot to say about the Opus 127. I just didn't really quite get it. So I'd encourage you, if you like Beethoven's late work, if you want some really kind of forward-looking music, to try it out. But I don't know. I didn't quite get it. But I'm going to be looking forward quite a bit to the other four, which are going to have their 200th anniversaries quite soon, because they're really great pieces of music. Really, really good. Some of the best. So, summary. We got El Señor Presidente by Miguel Asturias. That's our main feature. Penguin Classics, translation by David Unger, very recent translation. I think it's a good book. I think highly recommendable, simply because it's a high quality, and it's just from a different perspective, right? You've got early Latin American author, Guatemala, and it's good, right? This is not a pity pick. This is a good book. It won him the Nobel Prize. And it's just not, it's from a different perspective, and that's always good. That's always good. Obviously, Latin American sort of modernist novels would take off after this, but as being one of the first, one of the pioneering ones, I think it's a good choice. Then the little extras, Catland, if you like H.G. Wells and you want a sort of satire about early 20th century China, it's fun, but come on, it's not like the greatest thing in the world. Wittgenstein, Tractatus Philosophicus, Logicus, bunch of Latin words. I think it's good, but I would read a summary of it rather than reading the whole thing unless you're really into set theory, because it's quite difficult to follow. And even, I studied set theory at university for a little bit, and I really couldn't follow large portions of it. Then movies, Dial-M for Murder. Good movie. It's not, world historical, but, it's Hitchcock. It's got a great first half, but it kind of trails off. But there's something there. I think if you like Hitchcock, you like thrillers, mysteries, it's pretty good. One thing I will say, this is now spoilers. My pet theory is the argument the policeman gives, right, is that the key, that's put under the stair, that the man puts it under the stair as he enters. That doesn't make any sense to me. That's never prefigured anywhere in the story, as far as I can tell. And I went back and rewatched scenes. I think that's silly. So my headcanon is he actually, so he has to leave the room, or he starts to leave the room because the phone call comes late. Because the main villain, his watch isn't working. And so my headcanon is in the moment that he opens the door, with his left hand, he's putting the key under the staircase. And then once he hears the phone ring, he comes back in the room, but the key's already under the staircase. And that way, the blame for it isn't just like some weird screw-up that the guy going into the room does. It's directly traceable to the main villain. And it kind of comes to the point that's being made, kind of made portentously, right before he attempts this big plan by the mystery writer, who basically says, oh, I couldn't do this, something would always go wrong. So that's my little bit of headcanon with Dialing for Murder. Anyways, Dialing for Murder, good movie, but not, world historical. Alexander Nevsky, I liked it, but it's not for everyone, and it's kind of difficult. It's very operatic, very old-timey. It feels like a Soviet movie from 1938. Potemkin feels much more modern and much more kind of normal, so to speak, quote-unquote. It feels much more kind of, even though it's a silent picture, there's something about the editing that feels much more like an American movie. Probably because American movies, took that from it. Okay, then we've also got, to round us off, Beethoven's Opus 127. I personally would explore the middle quartets and the other late quartets before it, but maybe that's the wrong approach. Maybe if you listen to it first, and it's the first one that gets stuck in your head, that makes it make more sense. So those are the 6 books, movies, or pieces of music that I listened to in the past couple of weeks. And that's the first episode of this podcast. I'll be back in the future to update you on other interesting things I have read and listened to and watched. But yeah, feel free to provide any pushback. I'm sure I've misinterpreted many things. These are just my first impressions on these things. So, yeah, so long.